Okay. And I guess I should have said that little introduction during the recording, but we'll just say that welcome to another random walk down Mill Street. And tonight's topic is some of the Spanish Haftarot that are read in the Sephardic tradition, not necessarily here in Sheretz Israel, but in some of the Spanish Portuguese communities. So we're going to talk about that right now. Okay. Actually. Okay. I called it Echoes from the Past, some Haftarot Chanted with Spanish Targum. And the title will become certainly understandable as we go along. But the starting point for this talk is anyone who has been to Sheretz Israel for Tisha B'Av morning, not in the evening, but in the morning, and stuck it out till the reading of the Torah. Nowadays, we do the Torah reading earlier, but in the old days, we read all the keynote, and there's lots and lots of them first. Then we got the Torah reading, and the Haftarah wouldn't come till very late in the morning. So if you're familiar with that morning service, you will have encountered this. And this comes from the book that we use, which is the Leaser prayer book. I'm just going to make this a little smaller. Right in the middle of the, you get the Haftarah, the ending of the Torah reading. You get the brachot of the Haftarah. You get the first verse of the Haftarah, and then you get Tishol Yirmiyahu el Profita por Yisrael, Spanish language translation. If you know Spanish, or you can even just tell by looking at the length, this is more than just a translation. It is a Targum. It is a commentary, translation with commentary on the Haftarah. And so that's the topic for tonight, is this Haftarah and perhaps some others. I want to talk about the Haftarot of the 3 weeks, the Haftarah of Tisha B'Av. I want to talk about some of the translations and customs of how they're translated liturgically. And then finally, we're going to close off with returning to this particular Haftarah with some insights about its text, or at least the text of the Spanish translation. So that's the general plan. So I want to show you something here from, this is a Seder Chazanut of one of the Chazanim here in New York before the American Revolution. He was actually the person who trained Gershom Mendy Seiches. His name was Yosef Yeshurun Pinto. You can sort of see his name here, Yosef Yeshurun Pinto. He authored a Seder Chazanut. This is in the 18th century. He was Chazan in New York in the 1750s and 1760s. And then he goes back to Amsterdam and finishes his career there. He's born in Amsterdam. He's trained in Amsterdam. He becomes a Chazan in Amsterdam. He then is hired in London, and then in New York, and then he returns to Amsterdam, where he dies in the late 18th century. So in this collection of the Cantor's Guide that he wrote for himself and others, he has a certain area where he compares and contrasts the customs in London. It's pretty amazing because it sort of institutionalizes and tells you what was going on at a pretty early date. It's not a 19th century. It's an 18th century document. It's before the American Revolution. And you can see some of the things that we know from today already appearing back then. And one of the things you'll see here is that in London, they read the Haftarot of the 3 weeks in Hebraico y Ladino. They read it in Hebrew and in Spanish, which, because it appears in the differences, meant that they didn't do that same custom in Amsterdam. It turns out, which is not in this page, but in other places, you'll see that in Amsterdam they read the Shabbat Chazon, the last of the 3 weeks, in Spanish and Hebrew, and they also read the Haftarah of Tisha B'Av, as we saw, also in Spanish, in Hebrew and in Spanish. What they did in New York is not said in his book, but presumably they did something similar to what was done in Amsterdam. We have better evidence for what was done in New York in the 19th century. What you're looking at here are notes from transcribed really from Jacques Judah Lyon's Minhag book, where he talks about the 3 weeks. And I just want to show you what he said. This is from about 1844. And his instructions could be word for word what they do today, what we do here today in Sheretz Israel. Haftarot Divrei, that's last week's Haftarah. The blessings are chanted as usual, changing the tune at Ubin B'Yei Ha'emet V'Hatzedek, so the end of the first blessings of the Haftarah, leading right into the text of the Haftarah, you change the tune. Chant the Haftarah to its particular tune, meaning it has a special melody that's not used the rest of the year, until Lahatzilecha, which is one of the last words of towards the end of the Haftarah, and begin Vayhi Devar, that's the third to last verse in the Haftarah, to the ordinary tune, and finish the after blessings as usual. So this may be a complicated way of saying it, but you read the blessings as a regular Shabbat with its regular tunes, and then you have a special tune for the 3 weeks, which ends at the last verses of the Haftarah. Those last verses, by the way, are no longer predictions of doom. They're a little bit more uplifting, and so they get the regular Haftarah tune. It's only the predictions of doom and the coming of the evil from the north that gets these more sad tune. And that's the 3 weeks custom. Same thing again for this. We'll have this week Haftarat Shim'u. Observe the blessing as on Divrei. Chant the Haftarah to its peculiar tune till almost the last verse. The last 3 verses you have the ordinary tune. Same instruction. And then Shabbat Chazon, same thing. Blessings chanted as usual, changing the tune at Ubin B'Yei Ha'emet. The last 3 words of the blessings. Chant the Haftarah to its peculiar tune. And then he has this interesting addition, without the Spanish. Why does he have to say without the Spanish? Because in Amsterdam and elsewhere, that Shabbat Chazon Haftarah was chanted with the Targum, with the Spanish translation. Not in New York. But so he has to tell you that. No Spanish here in New York. And then the same thing. At the end, it returns to its ordinary turn and finishes. So, should we listen to what it sounds like according to the custom that we do now? The first recording we're going to listen to is the first few verses of Divrei Yirmiyahu, the Haftarah we read last week, and it's chanted by Chazan Nabarro of Amsterdam. That's what you're going to hear now.
Divrei Yirmiyahu ben Chilkiyahu min haKohanim Asher b'anatot be'eretz Binyamin Asher haya debar Adonam elav bimei Yoshiyahu ben Amon melech Yehuda b'shlosh yisri shana למולכו בימי יהויקים בן יאשיהו מלך יהודה נתון 12 שנה לצדקיהו בן יאשיהו מלך יהודה גלות ירושלים בחודש החמישי.
So that's could you hear that? I don't know. Were you able to hear? That's the 3 weeks melody. It differs from the regular Haftarah melody. Some of you may not be familiar with our regular Haftarah melody. But this is a Haftarah that we actually read. I think it's for Parashat Shemot. I can't remember exactly. So we read the same Haftarah to its regular melody earlier in the year. And I'll just read a few verses just so you can hear the difference. This is the regular, if my brain will allow me to switch, let's see if it'll do it, to the regular melody. Ubin B'Yei Ha'emet V'Hatzedek. That's the regular ending of the blessings. Divrei Yirmiyahu ben Chilkiyahu min hakohanim asher b'anatot b'eretz Binyamin asher haya devar Adonai elav bimei Yoshiyahu ben Amon melech Yehuda b'shlosh nesrei shana lemocho. And then Vahi bimei Yehoyakim ben Yoshiyahu melech Yehuda natom nashtei nesrei shana Letzidkiyahu ben Yoshiyahu melech Yehuda Gad gelot Yerushalayim Vachodesh v'chamishi. Not that you're gonna really pay much attention to it, but just it's a little bit more uplifting. It's a little bit happier in tone than the 3 weeks melody, which is sort of slow and drawn out and elaborate. And that's the way the difference in the two melodies goes. Now, interestingly, the melodies for the Haftarah in the Spanish-Portuguese tradition are very close to those in Morocco, especially the northern part of Morocco, what we call Spanish Morocco. And I just want to play the 3 weeks melody for you that's sung in Morocco. It's nearly identical, a little less slow, but almost identical. And here, this is what you're going to hear now. This is from a chazan named Lasri. And for those of you who remember the Lasri family at Sheretz Israel, I have no idea if they're related, but we'll see. This is what the chazan. This is available online, by the way.
דברי ירמיהו בן חלקיהו מן הכהנים אשר בענתות בארץ בנימין אשר היה דבר אדוני אליו בימי יאשיהו בן עמון מלך יהודה ב13 שנה למולכו ויהי בימי יהויקים בן יאשיהו מלך יהודה עד תום 12 שנה לצדקיהו בן יאשיהו מלך יהודה עד גלות ירושלים בחודש החמישי.
I was going to play you also Rabbi Rode doing Haftarah Chazon, but he's beautiful, he's great. But I think in interest of time, we're going to skip over it. Maybe we'll come back later if you have an interest at the end. But that's the 3 weeks melody, both the way we do it here in Sheretz Israel and the almost identical way that it's done in the Moroccan Nusach. Obviously, other Sephardic groups, Turkish groups, Syrian groups, they sing it differently, not the same way that we do. Okay. So what was mentioned earlier by Chazan Pinto in the 18th century was that in Amsterdam, they read the Haftarah of Chazon, Spanish translation, but in London, they did all 3 weeks to Spanish translation. And interestingly, those Spanish Haftarot were published in little booklets from Amsterdam in the middle of the 18th century. Let's see if we can move this out of the way. This one was from 1757. This is 3 years later, in 1760, both being published in Amsterdam. And as you can see, Haftarot for Shabbat Echa y Tisha B'Av in Hebraico y Español con su benedicciones. So here, this is the way they did in Amsterdam, only Shabbat Echa. Shabbat Echa is the same thing as saying Shabbat Chazon. But this one, also printed in Amsterdam, has Las Tres Sabbatot for the antes Tisha B'Av, the 3 weeks before Tisha B'Av. And as you'll see here, this is what it looks like: Hebrew, Spanish, Hebrew, Spanish, Hebrew, Spanish. The translations for these 3 weeks are literal translations, and they are almost directly out of the Spanish language Chumash that was printed in Venice in the 1620s. And so that's probably where they were taken from. Unlike what we're going to see later for Tisha B'Av. So this custom of reading the 3 weeks Haftarot with a Spanish translation wanes. And it is not done in London in London today. It's not done in Amsterdam. It's not done in New York. It's done nowhere, as far as I can tell. If you hear of a community that reads the 3 weeks Haftarot in Spanish, let me know. I'm very curious about that. But as far as I know, that custom no longer exists. But it did exist till a relatively recent period in France, in southern France, in Bayonne. And possibly for Shabbat Chazon in Paris also. There is oral evidence that they read the Shabbat Chazon Haftarah in Amsterdam in Spanish through the 19th century, and sometime around World War I or shortly before World War I that it fell out of use. In New York, as we saw, it was not done ever since the American Revolution. Maybe I didn't mention that, but they used to do all of these customs with Spanish and Portuguese as is same as in Amsterdam here in New York until after the American Revolution. What happened was Gershom Mendes Seixas, who was the Chazan that was trained by the fellow Pinto, who came from Amsterdam, he makes it a condition of his return. He was a Chazan during the Revolutionary War in Philadelphia, in Mikveh Israel, and I can say hello to Rabbi Gabai. And after the American Revolution, the Sheretz Israel community wants him back. So they write to him, will you come back? Said, oh, okay, you'll pay my salary. There's a couple of letters back and forth. We're negotiating his salary, trying to get as much as he can. But he has some other demands. And one of the interesting things is he says, I don't speak Spanish, even though his grandfather came from Portugal. He doesn't speak Spanish. He doesn't speak Portuguese. He doesn't want to use Portuguese in the liturgy. And it all drops out. So what had been done before him, which was to announce the honors of the Torah service in Portuguese, or the prayer for the government in Portuguese, or things like this, Haftarah, Shabbat Chazon, Shabbat Tisha B'Av, Haftarah Tisha B'Av, completely dropped out. And no more Portuguese in New York. No more Spanish or Portuguese in New York. But it kept going in some places until relatively recently. In fact, it's an interesting progression of what happens in France. In France, they did the 3 weeks Haftarot in Spanish, and they had it written in a manuscript. They didn't have those published books that I showed you from the 18th century are very rare to get, very hard to find. But what they did have was a written out manuscript that got handed down from Chazan to Chazan, or rewritten from Chazan to Chazan. And our late great friend, the Professor Herman Solomon, was given a copy of this manuscript in the 1950s by a Chazan named Herrera. And this is the little note that he gives it to him, who was the Chazan in Bayonne in southern France. And here you see them. And they are exactly the same language with small differences as was printed in those Amsterdam books. But one of the really interesting things about them is that they appear to have Ta'amei HaMikra written into the Spanish, not just for the Hebrew. So it's a little hard to see here, and that I examined it pretty closely today. I went up to the Yeshiva University Library to look at it in person, and the Haftarah of Dibrei, the first of the 3 weeks, doesn't seem to have any special notations at all, but Shim'u and Chazon do. Why that is, I don't know. But if you can sort of see here, let's see if I can point out something that you might recognize. Here you have the word Adonai written out. This is in the Spanish part. And right on top of it is what we call a Rabia, which also appears over the word Adonai in the Hebrew. But then you have other things. You have Ma'arich, you have some of the other, I think this is a Darga. You have different notes in here. Here's probably also another Rabia over here. Here's definitely a Rabia here. And whether the Chazan was actually chanting the Spanish to the same melody as the 3 weeks, I don't know, but I think it's probably likely. Otherwise, why would they bother to put in the Tamei Mikra in the Spanish? Don't know. And there are no recordings and no living people who can tell you what it sounded like at all in the Spanish. It dropped off around World War II and never came back. Okay, there's more I could say about this, but I will leave it to be. If you're really interested, a good friend of mine from France named Peter Nahon has written at least 2 papers on this exact thing, going through all the Tamim itself and the whole custom as it progressed in France. And so I would refer you to those papers. They're in French, so be prepared, but they're really great. Okay. So coming back to the Haftarah of Tisha B'Av itself. The note from Jacques Judah Lyons from the 19th century in New York says the following, that the Chazan stands on the north side of the table, and if you're orienting yourself in our synagogue, that would be the same way we do it today. We read not on the table. There's a low table that we read the Torah from, and the Chazan is on the opposite, is on the left-hand side for the reading of the Haftarah. It's actually interesting that he says Chazan, but we'll talk about that later. But the Maftir, the person who reads the Haftarah, stands on the left-hand side and chants the Haftarah. The blessings are read without any chant. They're just sort of plain reading. The Haftarah is chanted in Hebrew only. So he has to tell you in the 19th century that they're not using the Spanish here in New York, just because they haven't used the Spanish since the American Revolution. To the tune of Root, including Go Aleinu, which actually is interesting because this is something we don't do. We don't do Go Aleinu to the tune of Root, but that's expert baseball. We'll get to that another day. After which he reads the brachot without any chanting, without any chant, which is what we do today, pretty much, or very, very plain chant, quickly. So if you're interested in how the book of Ruth sounds, and again, I hope my brain will be able to convert for me on the spot. This is how this Haftarah sounds. Ubin bi'ei ha'emet ve'hatzedek asof asifim ne'um Adonai ein nanabim b'gefen v'ein te'enim b'te'ena v'hen ave nabel va'etein lahem yanabrum. Something like that. That's the Ruth melody. And then we don't read the Spanish here in New York. That's a custom here in New York. Why the Book of Ruth melody is used is a mystery. Don't know. There are connections between the Book of Ruth and some of the Haftarot and maybe even Echa, but I don't know why Ruth is brought here. Really don't know. Okay, but that is the custom. I should say, and Eob. We also read Eob to the melody of Ruth, and there are connections between the book, the themes of the book of Ruth and the book of Job. But that's maybe another class, another day. Let's take this moment to take a look at the chat. Syrians chant the blessings on Tisha B'Av. Okay, V'at Tzedek. Maybe one day we'll talk about the blessings of the Haftarah. Not today, but good catch. Okay. Okay, so now I want to read to you a teshuvah. This is from the 18th century. and it is from a rabbi named Raphael Meldola, very famous Portuguese rabbinic family. This particular Raphael Meldola was one of the earlier generations of a long line of chazanim and rabbis that went from Livorno to France to England, and actually he is a direct ancestor, this particular rabbi, of some of our most famous rabbis here in New York. David de Solapool and Henry Paramendes are both descended from Raphael Meldola. So here is a teshuvah that he has written in his compendium called Mayim Rabim. And here, ha-minhaga nihig miktzat kehilot hakodesh l'targem b'lashon la'az ezo haftara miyuchedet. There is a custom in some communities to translate into the vernacular certain haftarot, certain special haftarot. Which ones? Kegon Pesach, Atzeret for Pesach and Shavuot, O Tlata de Puranuta, the 3 weeks, and the Haftarah of Tisha B'Av. V'nohagin shel maftir ba'atzmo hu hametagem. And the custom is in those communities that the person who read the Haftarah himself does the translating. He reads the Hebrew, reads the translation, reads the Targum. And this doesn't sit well with him. And that's what the whole teshuvah is about. It's a long teshuvah. I showed you the opening paragraph and the penultimate paragraph, but there are literally 2 pages in between where basically he goes through all the history of the Targum in Talmud and in the Gaonic era, and he doesn't like that the same person is reading the Haftarah who's also reading the translation. But it's good evidence of what was being done in his day in the 17th century. So here he writes that Be'ir Livorno, which is where he started out his career, Be'ir Livorno, Shahaya Noheg, Hashliach Tzibor, Lahaftir, Lahaftir B'Tisha B'Av, HaHaftarah. The Chazan is the one who says the Haftarah on Tisha B'Av. V'achar kach hu ba'atzmo mitargama b'lashon Sfaradi. He himself reads the Targum, the translation, in Spanish. And then he tells you, V'kamu rabotai, the rabbis of Livorno got up, v'nimnu, and they stopped him from doing that. They stopped the Chazan from doing that. V'gamru levatel, and they were able to eliminate that custom. Hamin hagahu. V'itkinu, and they established, they gave a takana, shehe echad hamaftir, ve'echad hamitargem. There should be one person who reads the Haftarah and a different person who reads the translation. V'chein nohagim ad hayom hazeh. And so they're doing in Livorno until this very day, sometime in the early part of the 18th century. Then he goes on along trying to prove why this is correct, a long teshuvah. And at the end of it, he tells you, these are obvious things. After he had already went on and on, they don't have to go on anymore about this. And then he tells you, and because of this warning or this, the whole reason that he had just given prior, which I don't have for you here, Hanhagti po kihila kedosha nefutzot Yehuda asher be'ir Beyon. Here in the community that I'm serving in at the time that he's writing this teshuvah, which is in Beyon, was my custom. Shenohagim, that what we're doing in Beyon, Shenohagim lefaresh hatalat haftarot de Puranuta, that they were translating the 3 weeks haftarot b'lashon Sfaradi. The takanti shelo yehe hamaftir ba'atzmo hamefurash. The person who was reading the Haftarah should not be doing the translation. That's what he established there in Beyon. So this is firsthand evidence of what was being done. We saw already a later manuscript, but was already being done in the 18th century, and what the custom had been, which was that one person read both the Haftarah, the Hebrew and the Spanish, and what the rabbis in Livorno and in Bayonne seemed to dislike and change the minhag so that there'd be one person who read the Haftarah, another person who read the translation. And this apparently, this difference is absolutely evident in a much later source. This is the Keter Shem Tov, compendium of different minhagim, including Spanish, Portuguese, and other groups. We'll just read what he says here about the custom of the Haftarah of Tisha B'Av. Minhag HaSfaradim be'Eretz Yisrael, in Israel, London, Amsterdam, v'chol arei Turgama, and all of Turkey, the Targum Haftarah Tisha B'Av b'lashon Sfaradit Tzacha. They would translate into a pure Spanish. Aval ba'arei Afrik, Baghdad, but in African cities, North African cities, and in Iraq, the Kafria, I'm not really sure if maybe that's Cyprus. I'm not really sure where Kafria is. The Targumino to b'safa ha'aravit. They would translate this Haftarah not into Spanish, but into Arabic. And then he tells us, "Haminhag shehamaftir atzmo korei hapasuk be'ivrit v'chozer u'meturgamo." The same person would read the Hebrew, and then he would go back and read the translation. Ubiamenu, nowadays, which he's writing in the middle of the 20th century, around 1940, Ubiamenu harbe kihilot holechu mitbatel minhag hatargum. They don't do this Targum anymore. Some places were still doing the Spanish, but very few places were doing anything else. And the reason is because they didn't speak those other languages. They just did the Hebrew. Although not as much as not as much as Aramaic, right? In Aramaic, which is really a language that nobody spoke, there were people who spoke Spanish, especially in Turkey, especially in Morocco. There were people who spoke Arabic, especially in other countries of North Africa and Syria and in Israel. So why that custom was being eliminated, not so clear. So I should say that and Claude is right for bringing it up, the custom of reading a Targum is still alive and well in the Taimani, in the Yemenite community. I think they're probably the only ones who do it consistently. And they do it for the Torah, and they do it for the Haftarah. And if you've ever prayed with them, it's really long. Torah service takes a really long time. And so does the Haftarah. And there is a Maturgaman, there is someone who, not the person who's reading from the Torah, who stands and reads the Targum. And he stands on the side. The person reading the Torah stands in front of the Torah. The person reading the Targum stands on the side. And there's all sorts of interesting customs related to it. But that's in Aramaic, and not in Spanish, not in Arabic. That's in Aramaic to this day. Okay, now here I'm just showing you a source neged what we saw. We saw an 18th century source saying that there should be one person reading the Haftarah and one person reading the translation, and it shouldn't be the same person. And felt so strongly that he actually changed the customs that were being done in Livorno and in Bayonne in order to fit that conception of halacha. But here is an earlier tshuva from the end of the Rishonim period, from they call the Rashbats, Shimon Bar Tzemach Duran, who lived in, I think, Tunisia, or maybe Libya, but in North Africa in the 14th and 15th centuries. And here the question is asked to him about She'elat Shaminhag Artzechen L'Targem K'tzat Haftarot Shel Pesach V'Shel Atzeret B'Lashon Arami. They would translate special Haftarot, like on Passover and on Shavuot, into Aramaic. V'Shirat Devorah, the seventh day of Passover, where you read the song of Devorah, B'Lashon Hagari. You know what Lashon Hagari is? That's Arabic, the language of Hagar, Arabic. And then he talks about how there was one the question is involving whether one person can do both, or whether they can do some of the why are some of the translations into one language, another translation in another language. And he goes through a long teshuvah also, where he talks about what's done in the days of the Talmud, what's done in the days of the Goanim. And he says, Kol otan dikdukim, all those special rules that are learned out in the halacha, lo nemru ela betargum haTorah. They're only about when you're actually translating the Torah itself. Shelo yomru targum katuv b'Torah, so that no one should think, no one should say, no one should be confused that the translation is in the Torah text. Everyone should know the Torah text is pure, unadulterated, what is the received tradition, and the Targum is being read from another book, from something else, by a different person. No one should be confused. But the prophetic books, they're not, don't have to be as careful that you have to have one person reading one and one person reading the other. No one should get confused. The person who reads the Haftarah can do the translation himself. Okay, just to show you the other side of the coin. Here's the Shulchan Aruch. We'll skip the Shulchan Aruch. So you see both sides here. Okay, but also I'll show you right here in the Kaf HaChaim, which is 19th century commentary on the Shulchan Aruch. Yesh mekomot shenahagu letargem haftarah be'ezeh lashon. There are places that translate the Haftarah in any language. The Hamaftir atzmo, the person reading the Haftarah does it himself. But some people say that it's not good that he does that. The person reading the Haftarah should do the translation, and they should really do it. They should really not have the same person reading both. Okay. So now let's talk about what's done. What is actually done today among the communities that we know. So let me make this smaller. So the first thing I want you to take a look at is this musical notation. This is in a book called Sephardi Melodies, which was published in the 1920s, 1930s. It has in the front of it the notations made by Abraham de Sola in the 19th century. And then the second half of the book are done by a man named Yeshurun, who was the choir master in London in the early 20th century. And he has notation for the Haftarah of the 3 weeks. The Haftarah of Tisha B'Av. Asof Asifim Ne'um Adonai. This is the Haftarah read on Tisha B'Av. But really, really interestingly, the notation is in 4-part harmony. So how could the maftir be reading the Haftarah in 4-part harmony? Impossible. And this is actually the custom today in London, that the congregation reads the Haftarah together, and the maftir reads the Spanish alone. So what was being done in the 18th century or earlier, I don't know. But they are certainly today being careful to follow the rule of Rabbi Meldola, who said that the same person should not be reading both. And if you want to hear what it sounds like, I don't have a live recording to hear the congregation, but I do have a recording of the late Chazan Chalfon Ben Arosh, and this is what it sounds like.
אסוף אסיפם נאום עמוני, אין ענבים בגפן, ואין דנים בדנה, ולנבל, ויתן להם יעברו. Dijo Irmiyahu, el profeta por Israel, por cuanto pasaron por la ley escrita y la ley mental, tajando los tajares, dice Amonai, no como las uvas de la vid, que se cogen poca a pocas, ni como los higos de la higuera, que se cogen uno a uno, sino todo junto. Fruta y olla será arrastrada, rehollada y perdida, porque la ley santa que les di en monte de Sinai pasaron por ella.
So that's what it sounds like. To this day, they still read it that way, at least whenever there's a person who's able to in the synagogue. I believe If I'm not mistaken, that Philadelphia will also do that when there is someone who's able to read the Haftarah in Spanish. Is that still correct, Rabbi?
No, we don't Spanish anymore.
No more?
No
Okay.
more. No.
Well, it was once, and not even that long ago. I'll tell you why I know, because we have a recording of it from the late Chazan.
From Korea.
No, not from Korea, from
El Male?
El Male, Leon El Male. So they
That's
must have been
great.
doing it until the 1970s at least. Okay.
If I can go back to the issue of why we sing the melody of Ruth on the Haftarah of Tisha B'Av.
Yeah.
Since we know that the Tisha B'Av one day will be changed into a Yom Tov when the Mashiach will come. And since Ruth is going to give birth eventually to David HaMelech, which also from him will come the Mashiach, therefore the Haftarah of Tisha B'Av is sang to the melody of Ruth.
I like that drasha. Thank you.
I got it from a very solid
Solid source.
source.
Excellent.
Reverend Cardozo.
Okay.
And,
so, from Reverend Cardozo, perfect.
Yeah, and Goalenu that you
Yeah.
said, I got it from your grandfather of blessed memory.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. By the way, the Spanish is done not only in Bayonne but also in Bordeaux.
Well, let me I have more to go.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay.
We'll get back to you, I promise.
Okay.
Okay, so getting back to my presentation here. I have for you another thing to listen to, showing a different custom, where the same person is reading the Haftarah as well as the Targum. And this is a video that is made just a few years ago in Israel, in a synagogue that calls itself Moroccan, although I think it's more pan-North African. But listen to this. They're not singing in Spanish, but there is definitely a Targum. Tell me if you can make it out.
We've got passion, we've got determination. Like, and if we set our sights on something, you better believe it's happening.
ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם אשר בחר בנביאים טובים ורצה בדבריהם נאמרים באמת. ברוך אתה אדוני הבוחר בתורה ומשה עבדו וישראל עמו והאמת והצדק הסוף אסיפם נאום אדוני ענבים בגפן ואין תאנים בתאנה ועלי נבל ותן להם יעברו كاليرميا النبي على إسلام على جماعة إسرائيل نعرف نوم يقول الله سلهم العدو نبوخذ يقلون بابل كتعوم تل ما نكتال النوب من دليا اللي يكتع شوية شوية من تل من نكتال خرموس من كلمة شوية شوية صغار وكبار يغلون بابل على اختايتهم لا دي يختوا بالمعاصية لا من شفاك ولا من دير حام عليهم لا إنهم جزوا على ساعتي תורה שבכתב ותורה שבעל פה להוסיאתום. למה נשמע כלם לחכמים لا يكونوا يدرسوا عليهم لا الغلنا اللي فنوا معاهم على ما نحن يوشبين هأسفوا ونبوا العري המבצע.
All right, that's enough. I think. Did you catch that? I think that's Arabic. That's an Arabic Targum. I think Rabbi Gabai wants to tell me something. You have to unmute. Are you able to unmute? There we go.
Yeah. It's called Hakakia.
That was not Hakatia. No.
Yeah?
No.
That's not
No
Hakakia?
way. No way. That was Arabic. That was
Huh?
yeah.
It is Arabic.
That was Arabic.
No, no,
Hakatia,
no,
you'll
no,
hear
no.
Hakatia later. You'll hear Hakatia later. That's
Okay,
not Hakatia. Hakatia you recognize.
That's corrected.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's Arabic, no doubt about that. Yeah.
That one was Arabic. And the same person was reading the Haftarah and the Targum. And if you were paying close attention, they were not the same text. Not only were they not the same language, but they were not the same text.
That's right.
This one was talking about Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar nowhere appears in our Spanish version.
Okay.
So whatever they're using as their source text is different.
And
So-
the melody, he tried to make the melody on
I wasn't really sure. It's hard for me to follow, but that's just another, just to show you. So alive today in London is the way that we saw from Rabbi Meldola, that there shouldn't be one person reading it. But we saw in Israel there are places where one person will read Targum as well as the Haftarah, but not the Spanish Targum. I believe the Turkish communities do it also. I think I actually could have shown you. I should have shown you from Rabbi Azos in Ezer Bisarim or whatever in Seattle. There's actually, you can find that online also, with an Eastern Ladino translation, which is very similar. One person reading the Haftarah and the translation. Okay. Berber. Maybe. Okay. Okay, let's get back. I'm almost done. I know we're pushing the time limit, but we're almost done.
Okay.
So now I want to show you that it is not only this one Haftarah that is still done. It's not only the Haftarah of Tisha B'Av that is still read in Spanish in some places. And there are additional Haftarot that are still read in Spanish, in Hakatia, actually, in Gibraltar, and in what we would call Spanish Morocco, Tangier, Tetuan, places where they really kept up, the Jewish version of Castilian Spanish. And so I have a really wonderful recording of Abraham Beniso, who the late Chazan from London, who came from Gibraltar, reading this Haftarah. This Haftarah that I'm showing you is for the 8th day of Pesach. So it's only read in the Golah. It's not read in Israel. It's called Od Hayom Benob. It's a nice Haftarah, and it talks about, sort of the coming of the, it's a happy Haftarah. And in Israel, they didn't want to lose it. So actually, those communities that read a Haftarah on Yom HaAtzmaut read this Haftarah. Not in Hakatia, though. And here is what it sounds like. I want to show you, though, this is a prayer book for Pesach that was made a few years ago by a Chazan who lives in Gibraltar. His name is Ariel Belilo. It's a really beautiful prayer book. Has the text of the Haftarah. He then has the Targum Yonatan, which is not read, but we're going to talk about, is mostly the basis of the Targum in Spanish. Not perfect, but is mostly. So now we're going to listen to, this is the 8th day of Passover, Haftarah, as read in Gibraltar.
De conformidad con el vaticinio de Yeshaya el profeta, época del regio dominio del soberano Fisquía en las regiones de la Judea, el prepotente Sanferib, rey de Asiria, se propuso la conquista de Jerusalén, para cuya realización convocó a 40,000 eminencias, príncipes tributarios, cuyos olímpicos sitiales embellecía el precioso metal con sus dorados y rugidos rayos. Así consiguió su vasto y soberbio poderío organizar un tremendo y formidable ejército, en cuyas huestes figuraban 200,000 espadachines y lanceros, 260,000 saeteros y 100,000 cazadores. La infantería se extendía hasta 400 leguas. La caballería ocupaba un espacio de 40 idem. Ascendía el total de las tropas a 260.000 milarias menos uno. Idéntica fuerza personal en número.
You got all that? That's one verse. That's one verse. Now, it happens to be that the Targum Yonatan has a long introduction here, and this is reflected as well in the Spanish Targum. But we see the same kind of thing in the Tisha B'Av one that is in our tradition, at least in London. Long Targum, short verses, because there's a lot of commentary that's going on. And that will bring us to our final part of our discussion tonight, which is, where do these texts come from? Where do these texts come from? And I have no definitive answers, but there is a wonderful article by the late Chazan from Mikveh Israel, Alan Corey, talking about the Haftarah of Tisha B'Av, and he does a translation verse by verse into English, and there are notes, and he talks about what the source material could have been, might have been. And there are a lot of examples I could give. I'm going to give you one. Actually, before we get that. So you saw the text that I was showing you for that Od Hayom was from this fellow Belilo. I was looking for the Spanish text for that Haftarah because I wanted to follow along with Beniso, and I couldn't find it until I reached out to him and he sent it to me. But it was printed, but it's not digitized anywhere. It's very hard to find. But I wanted to show you one of the earlier printed versions, which I can find nowhere. I don't know how many copies were made. It was by a fellow named Benoliel, who wrote a sefer called Porat Yosef, where he has collected a lot of these Hakatia translations that were in use in Tetuan, Tangier, Gibraltar. I think he was born in Tangier. This is him, by the way. And I'm going to just spend a second on him because he is like the founder of this sort of like scientific study of this Hakatia, this North African Spanish, Judeo-Spanish. And so he's the first person who writes about it and talks about it and publishes poems and songs in it, some of his own creation, I think, and some that he had collected from North Africa. And he has one of his first books that he publishes is a collection of some of this material. And what does it have in it? Ilas Haftarot Ba'et Hahi Od Hayom Yasof Asifem. So they also did Ba'et Hahi. What's Ba'et Hahi? That's the Haftarah for the first day of Pesach. No longer done in Gibraltar this way, but it must have been done in Tangier and Tetuan at some point. I spoke to a Chazan from Tangier who now lives in Toronto, who told me that they do Od Hayom and Asof Asifem, meaning the 8th day of Passover and Tisha B'Av. They don't do the first day of Passover. Okay. If anyone ever comes around upon this book, Porat Yosef, I would love to see it. But now we're going to finish off with Alan Corey's work, and just one example of several. So if you read his article, it's not a long article, it's a very good article. He makes the argument that the text of the Spanish translation is more than a translation, which is pretty obvious if you read it. It's a Targum, but it's not a direct translation of Targum Yonatan, although it is influenced by Targum Yonatan. It has other things in it, including, to a great extent, the commentary of Kimchi, the Radak. Now, the Radak lived in, I think, the 13th century, 1200s in Spain. I could be a little bit wrong, maybe. Someone maybe can check up on that. But that gives you, so the translation in Spanish has to be after that time. The Radak is writing his commentary in Hebrew, but his commentaries are being incorporated into this translation that's being sung for the Targum in Spanish. And also, it's not going to be after the Spanish expulsion because the Western Sephardim who keep this Haftarah, they used Portuguese. They didn't use Spanish. So in our communities in London and Amsterdam, they use Portuguese for the prayer for the government. They use Portuguese for the announcement of the mitzvot. They have Portuguese phrases like "Morir habemos," which is going to come up on Tisha B'Av. They don't use Spanish. So this must be pre-expulsion Targum. Has to be after the 1300, has to be before 1492. He narrows it down even closer. He thinks it's between 1400 and 1450 by a Jewish translator who must be writing for people to listen to it who did not understand the Hebrew. But more than just a translation, it's also a kind of like a rabbinic drash. Anyway, here is one example of that Alan Correa shows. So here is the pasuk at the end of the Haftarah on Tisha B'Av. V'afitzotim bagoyim asher lo yadeu hema v'avotam v'shilachti acharehem et hacherev ad kaloti otam. I will scatter them among the nations. It's pretty terrible. Haftarah is terrible. That's why it's on Tisha B'Av. They will not have known them. I'm going to send other people to attack them with the sword until they are completely destroyed, till I have consumed them. Ad kaloti otam. You read the Targum Jonathan, you get a pretty accurate translation, pretty close translation. We have been lost among the peoples who do not know us. They have devastated us. They have destroyed us. And they have hired others to kill us. Shilachti acharehem, you have Egore betarheun de katlin de charaba. Ad de eshetze yaton, until we are exterminated. Ad kalotiotam, until we are exterminated, until they're completely gone. But what does our Spanish translation say? And I don't speak Spanish, but it says something like "Y matanza basta mi atemar los mos del ellos," which, according to Alan Correa's translation, is, "I shall invoke upon them evil decrees of persecution and slaughter until I destroy the majority." The majority of them. Majority of them. And that is exactly if you look up Kimchi, if you look up Radak on this verse, that is his comment. It's much shorter. It's not into a whole translation, but he says, when it says Ad kalotiotam, not everyone, the majority of it. And that is reflected directly in here. So my only point in showing this is that it's not a translation, it's a Targum. It's not Targum Yonatan, it's its own thing. It's based and heavily influenced by Kimchi, so it's later, but it's written by an unknown scholar, an unknown rabbi, who's giving this in Spanish. And with that, I'm going to close, but I'm going to close by also saying that why is this still a thing? Maybe it's not very common, but clearly it was kept very strongly. And I think it's because of Gerush Sfarad. I think it's because, in particular, they must have had other Haftarot with translations. Maybe not so many. We saw a few of them. But this one resonated with people who had been in exile, people who had lived as Catholics and returned. This one they kept stronger. And so that it's kept to this day. And I don't think there's much more to say than that. And I'll leave it. I'll let you all make your own comments. And let me figure out how to do that again. Okay. But I hope you enjoyed and I hope you learned something. And like I say, each one of these pieces could have been more. There's more about the melodies. There's more about the halacha. There's more about the origin of the text. But I hope I gave you a nice overview in that. Haftarah.
I could never understand Moroccan Arabic. It's Berber.
It sounds like Berber to you, huh? I don't think there's Judeo-Berber, but maybe I'm wrong. So has anyone heard? So actually, Claude, are there any Haftarot in the Syrian tradition that I read in Targum? Eov, I didn't talk about it here. I was thinking about it, but it would make it too long. there were places where Eov is read in Greek.
No.
I'm sorry, did I say Eov? I meant Yonah. Yonah was read in Greek.
No, all Hebrew. All Hebrew.
In Syrian only have Hebrew. Okay. What about in Egypt?
Same.
Same.
Yonah, why Yonah? Is it because of Greek, Yaman?
I
How
don't
about
know.
Shara Shamayim in Egypt? What did they do?
Right.
Didn't they
No,
have
no,
Spanish?
no.
Didn't they have
A
Spanish?
lot of influence of Shara Shamayim in London. A lot of influence.
What?
A lot of influence of Shara Shamayim of London and also Ribefort in Paris. A lot of
In
influence.
Egypt?
Yes, in Shara, only that synagogue, the main synagogue downtown. That's why I
What
know
does-
a lot of minhagim from what we learned when we were kids.
There was an
Haftarot?
interesting comment. I'm going to cut you off for a moment that Joseph wrote. So it is a fact that in those early in the 18th century, he said Ladino. He said Ladino, but he doesn't mean the Turkish style Ladino. He means Spanish. And actually, Herman Solomon has a comment on that when he talks about Pinto. But I think there you can see that in other places as well, where they use the word Ladino just to mean Spanish. Good comment, Joseph.
But Ladino originally is supposed to be the commentary, a translation of the Torah in Spanish, and then it became like they call it, because usually among people, Ladino-speaking people, they would say Españolit. They speak Spanish, they don't speak Ladino.
Ladino is just a translation of the prayer book of the
That's right.
Chumash.
Exactly. That's right.
Yeah.
But anyway, wonderful lecture. I'm sorry I was cut off. I don't know what happened.
That's okay.
Crazy. But yes, that's what Herman said, that it's still used today in Bayonne, Bordeaux, and Ribefort. I don't know if I don't really know what's. You can ask. There is a rabbi in Bayonne. Of course, he mentioned Peter Naon is of course very well knowledgeable about that area, particularly Bordeaux. But Bayonne, I want to say one thing only, that he sang the translation, the ta'amim of the Haftarah. That's why there was the ta'amim in the Haftarah. You heard it? Did you hear it?
Which one? Then Benarosh?
Yeah, Benarosh, that's right.
So Benarosh it's very interesting. And this is what they do in London to this day.
Oh yeah?
They do the Haftarah Asof Asifim,
yeah,
like we do here in New York to the Book of Ruth. In Amsterdam, they don't do it to the Book of Ruth melody. But the Sof Pasuk, this is really expert level stuff, everybody. The Sof Pasuk in London is not the Book of Ruth. It's what we do for the 3 weeks.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
And if you listen, you'll hear it. But I think he was doing that in the Spanish as well. I think he was.
As you notice, in general, everything, whether it's in Hebrew or in Spanish, it's always melodic, never recitative.
Yeah.
In everything, in every tefillah that we have, also in the synagogue or any whatever.
I think it's what makes it liturgical, is that it's not just spoken; it's chanted, it's melodic.
Yeah, very nice. So we hope that Hashem Tisha B'Av will be Yom Tov.
Yeah, we can do Od Hayom.
Od Hayom. Thank
Take
you very
care,
much,
everybody.
Very kind of you. Very nice, beautiful.
It's all about redemption.
Yeah.